welcome to another edition of Academic Excellence. I'm your host, Mr. Siren. And today's a special day. You know why? Because it's Friday. Everybody loves Friday. All right, excellent. Hope you guys are all doing well. I know it's been a turbulent week, but I think we're getting used to this new arrangement, and I think we're going to do fine. And so with that, 7th grade, please open your books to page 192. We're going to continue where we left off the other day. So last time we talked about setting up the Articles of Confederation, and we talked about how that wasn't really working. And so now they've called for a constitutional convention, and that's where we're going to start off with today. Right off the bat, there's two things you're going to have to know. You're going to have to know what the New Jersey plan is and the Virginia plan. Those are the two proposals going forward within the Constitutional Convention, and there's going to be some bitter disagreements between the two, and eventually you're going to come together with the Great Compromise that's going to form sort of the structural basis for what will be the government structure for the Constitution as we go forward. So let's start off with page 192, the Constitutional Convention. So it starts off talking about George Washington. George Washington retires from the war. He goes to Annapolis and he gives up power. That is something that really is not fully appreciated, I think, especially for the time. The fact that he had won the war, he had backing of the people, and he had the backing of the army, he could have done whatever he wanted. But instead, he goes to Annapolis and resigns his commission. He's, probably the most powerful man in the country right now, and he says, no, I want to go back to being a farmer. And that's what he does. He has no real interest in ruling, but, every time he tries to get away, they pull him back in. So that's where this starts. He wants to live only one thing after the war, and that's to spend the remainder of his life with his wife, Martha, Mount Vernon Plantation. He wanted nothing more of war, and he certainly wanted nothing to do with politics. The life of a gentleman farmer was what Washington desired, but as before, if this country asked for his services, he would serve. The country did ask for his services, and this time he served as president of the convention that would meet in Philadelphia to draw up a new constitution. Though as president, Washington could not participate in the convention's decision-making, he would serve as a very important function. It would be his task to bring unity to a group of men who had very different opinions on how to form a new government. Only Washington could do this, for he was a man of all the delegates respected. And that can't be underestimated. I mean, the man was, say what you will, you might be in favor of the Virginia plan, or you might be in favor of the New Jersey plan, or you might like this person, might like this. There might be some partisan issues, but everybody respected Washington. When Washington said something, when he stood up, people paid attention, they listened, they valued his opinion, and that really can't be underestimated. Except for Washington, who was only 55 years old, and Benjamin Franklin, who was 80, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention were young men. They were divided pretty much into two groups, those that favored a strong national government and those that wanted to have states have more power. And this is coming out of, again, the Articles of Confederation. The states had a lot of power under the Articles of Confederation, and it was a weak central government, which led to problems. It wasn't as unified as it could be. And so you have this debate, this fear of what would happen if we have a strong national government. That has the tendency to lead towards tyranny and these sort of things. But if you have a strong state government, you have individual states ruling it on their own, then you're not going to have a unified country. So they have to find a balance between these two things. So the second group feared a strong national government and wanted to make sure the states did not lose too many of their powers. Those who favored a strong national government supported what was called the Virginia Plan. Okay, so those in favor of a strong national government wanted called the Virginia Plan. Edmund Randolph of Virginia introduced at the convention. According to the Virginia Plan, the new government would have a president, a Supreme Court, and the Congress would be divided into two houses, each filled with representatives from the states. The members of the lower house would be elected by the people, and the members of the upper house, called the Senate, would be appointed by the lower house. Okay, so that's what they were calling for in the Virginia Plan. Unlike the Articles of Confederation, which gave each state one vote in Congress, the Virginia Plan gave larger states more votes than smaller states in both houses of Congress. Okay, the large states who were those had larger populations, smaller states with smaller populations. So it wasn't the geographical size of the state; it was the number of people in it. So in the beginning, it was based off of population. You had more uh, population, you had more delegates. Okay, so if New York was overpopulated, or was heavily populated, I should say, then they would get more representatives. If Delaware didn't have a large population, they would get less members. In this way, the states would not have equal representation, and the laws that would be passed if most of the representatives of the people wanted them, not if most of the states wanted them. So again, it's this fight between states' rights um, and the majority within each state. The men who supported the Virginia Plan at first controlled the convention. The delegates who wanted to protect state power did not have a plan to match the Virginia Plan. So most discussions were about how to adjust the Virginia Plan. Should there be one president? Should there be two? Some delegates thought of having one president was too much like having a king. Should members of Congress be elected by the people or appointed by the state legislatures? James Madison of Virginia, you can remember that name, that's going to be important. James Madison of Virginia thought that the people should elect members both the lower house and the Senate, while men like Roger Sherman of Connecticut thought that people could not be trusted to elect members to the federal government. So there's the backdrop of this. How much of this are we putting trust and faith in the people? Can the people do? They be trusted with such important decisions as electing these members? Through George Mason of Virginia, agreed with Madison that the people should elect their members of the lower house of Congress. He and others thought state legislatures should appoint members of the Senate. Okay. Now, George Mason, that's the famous George Mason of George Mason University. That's over on Braddock Road. So if you've heard of that university, this is the guy who's named after it. If the supporters of the Virginia Plan thought no one at the convention would oppose them, they were wrong. On June 9th, William Patterson spoke out in favor of small states and of those who wanted to protect state power. His own state of New Jersey, he said, would never accept the Virginia Plan, and on June 15th, he surprised the delegates by offering another plan for the Constitution, the New Jersey Plan. This plan stated that the only small changes should be made to the Articles of Confederation. We shouldn't overhaul the whole thing. We shouldn't get rid of it. We should just make some small changes to it. Most importantly, it said that all states should continue to have equal representation in the federal government. One state, one vote. Okay, so he's really big on the states because New Jersey was not as populated as, say, New York or Virginia or Massachusetts at the time. So he's looking out for his interests. He's looking out for his state and those sort of things. Those delegates wanted a strong federal government, though they thought it was unfair for smaller states to have the same power as larger states. When the New Jersey Plan was brought up for a vote on June 19th, it was defeated. This did not discourage the delegates of small states like New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. They decided that they would never enter into a union that had a constitution based on the Virginia Plan. So there's that issue again, that united issue, states' rights versus federal rights. And that's going to be played out all the way up until today. We see this today with immigration. Is it the federal government's job to enforce the border? Or if the federal government is not going to enforce the border, can Arizona do it on its own? Does Arizona, because it borders Mexico, can it set up its own border policy? So there's been court cases going back and forth on these issues. And so this is a really important issue. Another thing is in terms of states of emergency that we're going through now. So President Trump has issued a state of emergency for a federal state of emergency. Is it a federal issue or is it a state issue? So is the crisis in New Mexico the same as the crisis in California? It might not be. New Mexico might not need to do everything that California is doing to avert this crisis, or Minnesota, or some of these other states. You have to give some local leeway to the local politicians and the local people that live there in their own state, because there's different environments, different culture. They might not be having the same effects. So why are you going to waste all your resources on something that you don't need? And that's what the powers of the states is really important. The governor of New Mexico can determine what he needs to do in order to protect his citizens. He might not need to call out the National Guard, things like that. So these issues of state versus federal are really important. For many days, both sides argued and fought, but they could come to no agreement on the chief question: should states be treated equally in Congress, or should states with more people have more representatives than states with fewer people? Unless the delegates could agree on this question, it looked as if the convention would break up without having a written constitution. Okay, so again, this thing that we've talked about before, you've declared independence, you're an independent country, but can you keep the unity? Can you solve the problems? And there was real question about whether or not that was actually going to happen. There was a great fear that the whole convention might fall apart. Um, you know, 200 plus years later, we take it for granted. We don't really appreciate that. Um, but these people had partisan issues. These people were very passionate about what they believed in, and they argued back and forth in the same way that our politicians today do that. And they played the same games. There's this sort of romantic view of history and saying, oh, well, why can't we go back to the way it was, 200 years ago when George Mason and Edmund Randolph and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all these guys got along? Well, they didn't always get along, as we're going to find out through future lectures. They didn't get along really. They had very divisive debates, is what I should say. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are going to be bitter rivals. They're not going to get along with Alexander Hamilton all the time. There's going to be a duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. We don't have duels anymore. Our partisanship and our debates in Congress are not that bad. We don't have fights or anything else like that. But back then, it was very bitter. You had a lot of passion for that. So anyway, continuing, it was Roger Sherman who saved the convention, which was called the Connecticut Compromise. Sherman had offered this compromise in June after Patterson presented it to New Jersey plan, but no one was interested in it. Now in July, when it was clear that the delegates from smaller states and delegates from larger states could not agree, all were finally ready to listen to Sherman. The Connecticut Compromise said that the lower house, the larger states, should have more representatives than the smaller states. But in the Senate, each state should have the same number of representatives as any other state, 2 senators per state. And the convention voted on Connecticut Compromise and passed it on July 16th. Sometimes this is known as the Great Compromise, where it establishes the 2 branches of Congress, where you have the House that again is elected by the population of each state. So California is going to have more representatives in the House than, say, Alabama. Okay, that's the way the House works. That's why you have 435 members of the House. And then on the Senate, you're going to have 2 senators for every state, regardless of population. So New York has 2 senators, Delaware has 2 senators, Hawaii has 2 senators, Alaska has 2 senators, Texas has 2 senators, all the way across the board. And so that's how that starts to set up. I'm going to do a short one today. I'm going to end it here right now because it's Friday, and you guys were so good today. Make sure you guys go out and have some extra recess, okay? Tell your parents that you guys were really good today and have an extra 15 minutes on me. All right. You guys take it easy. Have a good day, and I will see you next week. Bye.